The same applies to Patton's role as commander of the fictional U.S. First Army Group in Kent, designed to create the impression that the invasion would occur at Calais rather than Normandy. In WWII's view, Farragut's assertion that the Germans concentrated on Patton as the general likely to command American forces in the invasion of France is mainly based on a misinterpretation of an entry in the German High Command's war diary and on a routine Air War Academy paper entitled Invasions General. In fact, says WWII, in a copy distributed in February 1944, Patton is the only senior Allied general in Britain and the Mediterranean not profiled with a brief, one-paragraph summary. Bradley appears, and so does Montgomery, but no Patton. WWII does not rule out his inclusion from a later version now missing. But anyway, such papers were standard products with the all services, from which nothing much can be inferred. What is significant, however, he notes, is that the German High Command did not identify Patton as the commander of this fake U.S. First Army Group until well after they had fallen for the Calais ploy. So Patton's presence in Kent was not the decisive factor in the German miscalculation. The Germans did not track Patton's movements as the key to Allied intentions. They never raised his name in the context of worthy strategists. Hence, their intelligence efforts were much more focused on people like Montgomery and Eisenhower, because this was the level on which strategic decisions were made. Instead, says WWII, the Germans viewed Patton, in the narrow context of armored commanders, as a skillful tactical commander, an executor of the plans of others. He quotes General Gunther Blumentritt. We regarded General Patton extremely highly as the most aggressive panzer general of the Allies. His operations impressed us enormously, probably because he came closest to our own concept of the classical military commander. He even improved on Napoleon's basic tenet, activite, vitesse. When interrogated in 1945, Heinz Guderian, the Wehrmacht's foremost practitioner of blitzkrieg, stated, "I hear much about General Patton, and he conducted a good campaign. From the standpoint of a tank specialist, I must congratulate him on his victory since he acted as I would have done had I been in his place." But according to WWII's figures, while the U.S. possessed only one armored commander above division level and only a handful of first-class armor generals at division level, the Germans produced them by the bushel. Out of 266 officers with armor experience, he says, 55 stayed with the panzers throughout the war, most achieving the rank of General der Panzertruppe. Moreover, the Waffen-SS and the Luftwaffe had their own panzer generals. Among this group, Patton probably would have been merely above average. What is more, notes WWII, the Germans have a tradition of rather stringent assessment of military commanders, and it would take more than Patton's campaign in Sicily to seriously impress them. WWII quotes Helmuth von Moltke, chief of the Prussian General Staff and the man responsible for Germany's victory in the 1870-71 Franco-Prussian War, who, when compared with Napoleon and Frederick the Great by a flatterer, declined the honor, "For I have never conducted a retreat, the trickiest of all military maneuvers." Neither had George Patton. Patton's adversaries, on the other hand, had plenty of experience in this art form from Russia, where the Wehrmacht's early victories had turned into a nightmare struggle against the cold and against a Russian enemy that seemed to have an inexhaustible supply of manpower and replacement tanks. Thus, many of the commanders Patton was to meet in France had participated in Manstein's retaking of Kharkov, a brilliant move designed to straighten out the German line, and in the subsequent Battle of Kursk, the largest tank battle in history, which resulted in irreplaceable German losses of material. In short, writes WWII, German officers were prepared psychologically for the Allied invasion of France. Coinciding with the Battle of Kursk was the Allied invasion of Sicily. The Germans considered the island undefendable and their Italian allies useless. Facing superior numbers, German forces still managed to put up a successful defensive battle, allowing them to get 60,000 men plus heavy weapons across to the mainland, thanks to relatively weak, delaying forces. As WWII notes, The German commanders were not impressed by Patton's drive to Palermo, which involved territory they had already given up. Nor were they overawed by the American performance in what he calls smash-mouth fighting. As the chapter heading Sicily, Empty Glory, indicates, WWII, like others before him, is highly critical of Patton's race to beat Montgomery to Messina, especially the risky and bloody, amphibious operation at Brolo, which proved unnecessary and can only be ascribed to Patton's thirst for personal glory. In Normandy, the Germans were again defending. On August 1st, Patton, finally back in good graces after the slapping incidents, had been given command of the Third Army and played the starring role in the American breakout at Avranches. The German forces were on the verge of being encircled, but owing to the failure of the Canadians to quickly close the Allied pincer and a furious Patton being under strict orders to stay put at Argentan, the Germans managed to slip through what became known as the Falaise Gap. The gap was only 12 miles wide, but through it some 100,000 Germans managed to escape, whereby an Armageddon was reduced to an outright disaster. As a result, those who had gotten away would regroup and be among the forces Patton would fight along the German border. All the way towards the frontier, the Americans faced delaying tactics, courtesy of General Kurt von der Chevalerie, a veteran of the fighting around Kiev. On der Chevalérie's achievement, WWII quotes Patton's assistant intelligence officer Colonel Robert Allen. In Lorraine, Patton's bloodiest campaign, he was up against some of Germany's toughest officers. Of these, WWII singles out General Hermann Bulk, who performed the kind of flexible defense he had practiced in Russia on the Chur River. Thus, on the Moselle and in the siege of Metz, the Germans forced Patton, short on gas and ammunition, into practicing the type of piecemeal attack that he deplored in others, and leading Bulk to speak of the poor and timid leadership of the Americans. Waffen-SS Gruppenführer Simon likewise saw the American tactics as cautious and systematic. The tactics of the Americans were based on the idea of breaking down a wall by taking out one brick at a time, he said, adding, "Had you made such attacks on the Eastern Front, where our anti-tank guns were echeloned in depth, all your tanks would have been destroyed." Patton himself admitted, "While my attack was going forward by short leaps, it was not very brilliant." According to WWII, even Patton's logistical feats before running out of gas and his boast that, as of August 14, 1944, the Third Army has advanced further and faster than any army in history, totaling some 300 miles altogether, still put him well behind General George Hans Reinhardt, who at start of Operation Barbarossa covered more than 500 miles towards Leningrad, and Otto von Knobelsdorff, who in 6 weeks managed 800 miles, a feat which Knobelsdorff himself termed unique in Prussian-German military history. The book clearly takes its place in the school of the Allies won the war, but the Germans had the better army, a school that includes the Israeli military historian Martin van Creveld and the Brits Max Hastings, John Keegan, and John Ellis. This view was most starkly presented by John Ellis in Brute Force, a comprehensive assessment of the Allied effort in World War II against Germany and Japan, which, in passing, reduces Patton to some sort of a glorified traffic cop. While acknowledging Patton's ability to maneuver, Ellis characterizes his dash across northern France, as well as his earlier, much overrated pursuit through Sicily, as more of a triumphal procession than an actual military offensive. On Patton's performance in Lorraine, Ellis gets caustic. The purpose of Ellis's book was not to downplay the sacrifices made by the American troops, but to serve as a warning to the West about getting complacent in its defense spending, instead putting its faith in the ability of some great general to save the day in a future war. By ignoring the vital question of material preponderance, we do not only inflate the reputation of great commanders, but we are also in danger of encouraging absurd obsessions of innate national ability at the expense of a solid admission that the odds were stacked heavily in the Allies' favor. WWII isn't quite as reductionist as Ellis. But the more complimentary German assessment of Patton's abilities tend to be drowned out by those who stress the tremendous resources at his disposal, and by the author's own constant emphasis on Patton's luck, such as his having taken command in France, after nearly 7 weeks of hard fighting by the British, the Canadians, and the Americans of the First Army had worn the German army in Normandy to tatters. And a bit further on, just as Patton strode onto the stage of the European theater, the other fellow in Normandy was reeling backward and out of Patton's way, off balance, running out of men and equipment, and looking for a way to extricate himself from an already losing fight. Italics mine. As an indication of the mood in the German high command, WWII quotes Alfred Jodl, the German chief of staff, who in captivity confessed, "The war was already lost in the West at the time of the breakthrough and the beginning of the war of movement in France." As with Ellis, this tends to reduce Patton to a mere pursuer, impressive when chasing a fleeing foe, less so when meeting determined opposition. Even the feat that is considered Patton's greatest achievement, turning the 3rd Army divisions 90 degrees and heading north within 72 hours to fight the Battle of the Bulge, does not escape a slight deflation. By the time Patton gained real contact with the enemy, most Germans had concluded that the offensive was already spent. Patton once again would attack his enemy when the other fellow was switching to his back foot. Like Ellis, WWII emphasizes that in no way does this detract from the men who sacrificed life and limb in the Allied cause. And at no point is there a hint of glorification of the German side, only a clinical assessment of its fighting abilities. WWII scrupulously registers the crimes of people like Max Simon, who killed 10,000 civilians in Kharkov when with the Totenkopf division in Russia, and who helped massacre a further 2,000 civilians at Marzabotto, Italy. Unfortunately, Nazi war criminals could be quite effective on the battlefield. How would the Patton corner respond? It is a fact that while the Germans had long prepared for war, the Roosevelt administration had to scramble to build an army in a hurry. This meant greener troops and a less experienced officer corps. It is also a fact that since the Civil War, America has relied on overwhelming firepower to win its wars. But as participants, the Germans could hardly be expected to be unbiased observers of their own defeat. At this stage of the war, Hitler was busy promoting committed Nazi officers in the belief that they would put up a more stubborn defense. Such people would surely have found it easier to blame their defeat on an enemy relying on raw industrial might than to acknowledge his fighting skills. One is reminded of an incident in the final days of the war when a German officer was berating the Americans for sending their tanks through buildings instead of fighting it out in the open, a bit rich coming from a representative of the Third Reich's armed forces, which had been perfectly happy to use tanks against Polish cavalry. WWII, like Ellis, does mention that some former Wehrmacht officers later upgraded their views of Patton, which he ascribes partly to a cooling of passions, partly as an attempt to curry favor when Germany joined NATO. A number of retired Wehrmacht generals became NATO consultants. This may be so, but at least this cannot be said of Erwin Rommel, who was forced by Hitler to commit suicide in October 1944. Carlo D'Este's excellent Patton biography, A Genius for War, quotes Rommel, noting that after the initial American setback in Kasserine Pass, things had rapidly improved for them. Although we had to wait until the Patton army in France to see the most astonishing achievement in mobile warfare. Concerning Patton's thirst for glory, of which WWII views his race with Montgomery across Sicily as a prime example, Martin Blumenson, the leading Patton specialist, sees a less suspicious motive. British Field Marshal Alexander, mistrustful of American prowess on the battlefield, had relegated Patton's forces to a secondary role, acting as shield to Montgomery's sword. This Patton was determined to change, not so much for his personal glory, although that was important, but rather to prove to the world that American soldiers were every bit as good as, indeed better than, British troops. That meant entering Messina before the Brits. On Patton's performance in France, his campaign in Lorraine was certainly no beauty, but might have been avoided altogether. His former subordinate had been in overall charge of the American forces. As both Bloomington and Carlo Dess see it, Patton would not have waffled over the Falaise Gap, and his plan, an ambitious long envelopment rather than Bradley's short hook, might have trapped and killed the German Normandy army west of the Seine. Unfortunately, as a result of the slapping incidents in Sicily, the less gifted officer was calling the shots. As to the element of luck, Patton, like Napoleon, believed that luck was an essential element in the makeup of a great commander. But one reason Patton was lucky was due to his meticulous planning. Another was his intuition. Another was his intuition. Thus, Bloomington stresses his uncanny ability to be in the right spot at the right time, and his instinctive feel for when something was up, perhaps best illustrated in the days leading up to the final German offensive. His intelligence section was reporting enemy activity in the Ardennes, and Patton seems to have grasped its significance sooner than others. And as WWII himself points out, the Third Army headquarters was the only Allied headquarters to begin planning for its eventual role in the Battle of the Bulge. "We will be in a position to meet whatever happens," Patton noted. But interestingly enough, on the main point that the Germans were the more effective soldiers, Patton would almost certainly agree, himself excluded, of course. As WWII writes, in contrast to his public statements, his diary and letters often deplore the lack of initiative of his troops. Even during the Battle of the Bulge, he wrote, "The Germans are colder and hungrier than we are, but they fight better." Yet he kept goading, pulling, and willing his troops on to victory. That is his great achievement. On this background, it is only natural to ask what the Germans thought of him, and how he measures up to the Wehrmacht's panzer generals, which is what WWII's fighting Patton, George S. Patton Jr. through the eyes of his enemies sets out to do. As WWII emphasizes, this not a biography, but a meticulous recreation of Patton's campaigns seen from the German perspective. On the benefits of this method, WWII quotes British military historian Basil H. Liddell Hart. It is different in one important aspect from looking at it through the opposite end of the telescope. For instead of being minimized, the picture is magnified with startling vividness. Having been on the receiving end, the German officers were uniquely positioned to assess Patton's effectiveness, though there are certain caveats. Thanks for watching. Hoping you will enjoy this WWII warrior historical story. Please press the subscribe button.